So let's now work on gathering user input. And as I said, for a start, I want to react to every change in any of the inputs. So for example, on every keystroke, and I simply want to get the value the user entered and store that somewhere. And for example, just log it to the console. Now, to do that, for a start, we need to add listeners to listen for every keystroke or for every change of these inputs. And you learned that you can do that on the element where you want to add a listener. So for example, on this input here, by adding a prop that starts with on, and then the question just is to which event you want to listen. Now we could listen to on input and therefore react to basically every keystroke, but there also is the on change event, which basically does the same here. It will also trigger on every keystroke, but the advantage of the on change event is that we can, for example, use that same event for all input types, for example, also for dropdowns. So here I will add on change this event listener to this input, or this prop to this input, and under the hood, this will then add an event listener for the change event to the input element which is rendered in the DOM. And then we need to point at the code, at the function that should be executed when that event occurs. Now you learned that we can define it inline here with a function or with an arrow function, but that it's better to define it up front, and therefore that's what I'll do. I'll add a new const and name it title change handler to make it clear that this will be called upon an event. I end with handler. And I'll name it title change handler because this function, which I'll store here, should be executed whenever this, title input changes. So here, for the onChange prop, I'll pass a pointer at this title change handler, so at this function here, as a value. And again, we don't execute it here. We don't add parentheses. We just point at this function. And this, if I console log now, will now execute whenever we type in this title input field. So if we go back and open the developer tools, if I type here in the title, you see title changed for every keystroke I do. Now that's great, but typically we want to get the value the user entered. And the question now is, how can we get that value? Which possibilities do we have here? And the answer is quite trivial, at least if you know vanilla JavaScript, so JavaScript without React. If you would add an event listener to some element in vanilla JavaScript like this, then you would listen to, let's say, the click event, and in the function which you pass as a second argument, which by the way is basically the function you pass as a value to this prop, there you automatically get an event object which describes the event which occurred. That's a default JavaScript behavior you get in the browser when you listen to events. And we get this default event object here as well, automatically. We don't need to do anything to get this. Since we pass this function to React basically through this onChange prop, React will make sure, or actually even the browser itself will make sure, that we get such an event object when this change event occurs. Now we can log this object to see what's inside it. So I'll log this event argument, and if I now reload and I start typing, I get this object here. And this object has a bunch of data. The interesting thing for us is this target field here. This target here simply points at the DOM element for which the event occurred. So in this case, this input. And this input element in turn has a long list of properties which we can read and set. But most importantly for us, it also has a value property. And this value property holds the current value of this input at the point of time this event occurs. And that's super useful, because that means that we can drill into this target and then this value I just showed you to get the value which was currently entered when that event occurred for that element on which we're listening. So now if I reload, you see that I get the current value with every keystroke. And that's super useful. Now we got this value.